Thank you very much. We're back again. This is section number 9 of our study through the Old Testament. And our, what would this be? Our 7th session in Genesis, and we've gotten all the way up to chapter 12. It takes a while to get through, and that's okay. I'm enjoying the opportunity to move slowly through all of this material, but frankly, beginning today, well, we're going to move a little faster. I don't want to rush through anything, but I do want to get us all the way through the whole Old Testament in a survey within a reasonable amount of time. So far, here's what we've done with Genesis. Genesis lays foundations for the whole rest of our understanding of the Bible. To understand who God is, what man is about, why sin is a bad thing, how God is responding to sin in the world. All of these are fundamental questions: how grace works, how faith works, how holiness operates. All of these things are developed for the first time in this book of Genesis. The first section of Genesis, the first 11 chapters, take us through the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. The very beginnings of all of human history are covered in this this chunk of scripture. There are some problems. The critics, generally speaking, don't like these foundational chapters, and you can read the commentaries to that effect. When we read the non-Christian commentaries or the Christian but not conservative commentaries on the book of Genesis, all of them agree that the earth is billions of years old, that God created by means of evolution, and that all of the stories that we see are just myth. I disagree with that. I think the first 11 chapters of Genesis have all the evidence of history. And because they are history, they are real foundation for everything else that the Bible teaches. When we get into chapter 12 of Genesis, we're shifting gears. We're out of the look at the broad swath of the human race, and we begin focusing on one family. So Abram, who becomes Abraham, is called out of Ur of the Chaldees. And God said, go, so Abram went. And we spoke last Monday of that basic event being the essence of faith. We can see faith earlier than this. Noah exercised faith. Even Adam and Eve exercised faith. But Abraham comes up again and again throughout the rest of the Old Testament and on into the New Testament as the father of the Jewish people and the man of faith. And his faith is a response to what we call the Abrahamic covenant. I'm going to start sharing the screen here, and I'm going to end up having to go over to the whiteboard eventually, but we'll get there. So as we get into this patriarchal history of Israel, we're going to be looking at Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. Joseph is interesting because he's not the child of promise. Abraham is in the line of Christ, so is Isaac, and that's very important. Jacob is in the line of Christ, and that also is really important as we get there. But Joseph is not in the line of Christ. Judah is the next in line, And the fact that Judah is in the line of Christ is actually very important, and we'll cover that when we get there. Joseph provides the transition to the book of Exodus. So the rest of Genesis is kind of laid out before us in this section. In chapter 12, the first four verses, or the first three verses, we see an outline of what we call the Abrahamic covenant. This covenant is an unconditional promise to Abraham. And that's important. We're going to see the emphasis on no conditions to the promise several times in Genesis, including some very important spots that are quoted over and over in the New Testament. The promise to Abraham involves four components, and I have them listed here. And these are reiterated or repeated later on in the text of the Old Testament. So, for instance, the first of the promises is what I call a territorial blessing, the land. This promise to Israel is very different from the promises to the church. The church has never promised a land. We're often told that we'll be driven from one place to another. We'll have to move. We'll be persecuted. We'll always have trouble. This world is not our home. We're just tabernacled here. We're in a tent waiting for heaven. But Israel is given a specific patch of land. We see that repeated again in the Palestinian covenant over in the book of Deuteronomy. The national blessing is different from the territorial blessing. Territory is land. The nation is a people group united by culture, language, religion, and worldview. The people of Israel are the offspring of Abraham through Isaac, and ultimately through Jacob and the 12 sons. They become 12 tribes of Israel. They'll go down to Egypt and become a great nation. That's the national blessing. The national blessing for Israel is repeated for us in a bunch of places in the Old Testament, but the most famous is the Davidic covenant of 2 Samuel 7, where David tries to build a temple for God in Jerusalem. And God said, "Did I ever ask you to build me a temple?" Actually, this is Nathan talking to David for God, but God says, "Did I ever ask you to build me a temple? I'll tell you what, you're not going to build a temple for me, but I will build a house for you." And that house is the dynasty or the kingdom of David. God goes on to explain what he means by that in this 2 Samuel 7 covenant. The Davidic covenant, like the Abrahamic covenant, is unconditional. Now, interestingly, the Palestinian covenant is conditional. You'll get to stay in the land until you sin. The Abrahamic covenant gives the land to Israel forever, to you and your descendants forever. The Palestinian covenant says you'll be blessed in the land as long as you are obedient. Deuteronomy 28 is actually quite important, and we'll spend some time there when we get to it. The personal blessing to Abraham is the blessing of salvation. We see this expanded in places like Exodus 20. The Mosaic covenant is again a conditional blessing. If you are obedient and do these things that I'm telling you, then you'll enjoy the blessing of your salvation. The salvation itself is unconditional. We're going to see that in some other places. But the blessing of that salvation is conditional on obedience. That's an important distinction. Over in the Psalms, David, after his sin with Bathsheba, says this rather poignant thing. Against thee and thee only have I sinned. Restore unto me the joy of my salvation. David was never worried about losing his salvation or becoming a pagan. That was not an issue for him. But he was concerned about the loss of the joy of his salvation. The blessing is gone. Eventually, we see the Abrahamic covenant fulfilled in the Old Testament in the New Covenant of Jeremiah 31. This is a prediction of a universal covenant or a universal blessing. God says to Abraham, through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. All the nations are all the people groups. Every language, every culture, every worldview will have the opportunity to walk with God. Now, it's possible to watch all of this playing out in, let's see, in history. I'm going to give you some, let's see if I can, let's see here. Share the screen and share the whiteboard. All right, there we go. And this is all of this stuff that's playing out in history, and there's history going on. Remember earlier I said there are two programs that God is working on, what we call the kingdom program and the redemption program. Now, both of these have to do with Christ. Both of these are found in the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant is more detail about how the kingdom and the redemption programs will be fulfilled in history. And so we look at the history here, and we're going to start around 2000 BC, and here's where Abraham is. Okay, and God gives to Abraham this Abrahamic covenant, which says, I'm going to bless you and make your name great. I'm going to make you a great nation. Through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. That's through both kingdom elements. Much of the blessing is through the kingdom of God coming down to the earth in the form of the king himself. The redemption program is, again, God himself taking the form of a man born in the line of Abraham, who will lay down his life for our salvation. The kingdom program is fulfilled at the very end of time with the reestablishment of the Davidic covenant in Jerusalem for 1,000 years. All of this is set up to happen, and it all fulfills this promise to Abraham. So Abraham, around 2000, in Moses, around the time of 1500 BC, we see the giving of the law and the establishment of the people of God in the land. Okay? So the promise of a land is fulfilled in 1500 or so BC, actually about around 1400, but it's close enough. About 1000 BC, we see David. Actually, David becomes the king in 1010 BC. And this is the beginning of the fulfillment of the kingdom program. Saul really does not do that. David begins the kingly line, which will lead to Christ. David, of course, is in the line from Abraham. So we come all the way down to this point. The new covenant dates to around 500 BC. 600 is closer, but that's Jeremiah. Here is the new covenant, where Jeremiah says, I'm going to establish a new covenant. I'm going to plant it in their hearts. No more will a man tell his brother, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the greatest to the least. The new covenant is looking forward to the coming of Christ. Here's the first coming. And this is around 0. And here we are at 2000. We're at 2020, actually. And here we are in the church age. Okay, stop it. Here, the church has been happening for all these years, and now we're looking forward still to the kingdom. As Christ returns, he will set up his millennial kingdom, which will lead to the universal kingdom. So kingdom and redemption programs are tied up in all of these elements all along the way. The Abrahamic covenant gives us a roadmap for all of the rest of biblical history. It's a fascinating and important thing to keep track of. Let's see if I can make it clear the drawing. There, stop that one, and we'll go on. So what are we talking about here? So the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. Him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went. I need us to have a look at the map again. I'm going to share the screen. We're going to share that one and go. Oops, so daisy. Binky, there's a map for us. See if I can get some pointers. Let's see if I can get a laser pointer. That will work. Okay, there's a little pointer that we can probably see on the screen. Has got to be right down here in southern Mesopotamia. Is south of the city that would become Babylon later. Abraham, with his father Terah, when God said go, he went, and his path was northwest up the Mesopotamian valley. He came all the way to the high ground here, way up in the north, under this little word armies. The city of Haran is found here. When Terah died, Abraham continued along what is called the Fertile Crescent. All of this from the Persian Gulf, up the Mesopotamian Valley, into the mountains of Turkey, down into the mountains of Syria and Lebanon, and heading on south on the international trade route and the King's Highway, until finally we come down to Israel. Abraham came as far south as Israel. And at that time, we're going to find some other interesting things going on. Among other things, Abraham is going to go on to Egypt. And here's Egypt over on the left. Egypt and the Nile Valley also form a part of what we call the Fertile Crescent. So kind of a crescent moon-shaped patch of fertile ground. It's actually possible to live in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and in the mountains of Syria and in the Nile Valley, even along the coast. All of this is a good place to live. You'll find cities here. But you notice out in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, not so much. There are no cities out there. There are no roads out there. There's not much of anything out there. Today, it's possible to cross that desert with specialized equipment or with an airplane. But in ancient times, that desert was a vast, impenetrable barrier. The Bedouin only penetrated the desert for relatively short distances. They could go a day or two into the desert, but that's where they had to stop because there's no water, there's no vegetation, nothing grows, nothing lives in that desert. So God said go. Abram went. That's foundational. He went along this Amorite highway of the Fertile Crescent. God said go, so Abram went. In the rest of this chapter, God said go, Abram went. Lot went with him. A note in verse 4, Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So Abram took Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, all their possessions, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, this is a confirmation of the covenant, to your offspring I will give this land. Let's think about that again. Here he was between Shechem and Jerusalem, probably at the Oaks of Moreh, and no, we don't know where that is, but he's on what we call the Patriarchal Highway, the highway through the hill country of Israel. And God says, this is the place, you've arrived. This is the place where I'm going to bless you. To your offspring, I will give this land. Now, notice the repetition of things. Earlier, God has said, I'm going to make you a great nation. You're going to be a huge nation. And Abraham is probably wondering, well, how is that possible? Since, as we've also been told a couple of times now, Sarai is barren. Now, both Abram and Sarai are getting older. And that means, as those of you who have started families probably understand, that things are not getting better, they're getting worse. It's becoming less and less likely that things will work. So the promise is, to you and to your offspring forever, I will give you this land. So the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, that, my goodness, how did I do this? See if I can get a, Well, how interesting. I've made some marks on my slide, and now I'm going to have to figure out how to unmake my marks, but I won't do it today. The essence of the problem, and what everything depends on, is that Sarai is going to need to have a child. And that child is going to need to be Abraham's son. So Abraham and Sarah are going to have to figure this out. And that forms the core of the whole Abraham narrative. That's what it's all about. And God is going to wait until it's beyond human hope. With both of them 75 years old, maybe they can still make things work. Who knows? You know, it's always fun to try, and you never know. And people would look at that and say, well, that's unusual, but that's great. They're starting a family a little late in life, but that's a good thing. God is going to wait until they're both long past the normal time for starting a family. And that's the point of that. To you and your offspring, I'll give the land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And from there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel, pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev, which is the southland, the desert to the south. So what's going to happen next? I should emphasize what's going on in verses 4 through 9, story of the journey, and then the completion of the journey at a place between Shechem and Bethel, north of Jerusalem. Abraham builds an altar. That altar is a commemorative thing. Abraham builds altars in commemoration of the mighty acts of God. When God does some great thing, Abraham builds an altar. And we're going to find this is true in the patriarchal narratives. It's consistent throughout this whole passage. The patriarchs build altars and do sacrifices. There is no priesthood. So Abraham was not a priest. Neither was Isaac or Jacob, and yet they built altars and made sacrifices. We're going to find that this is also true in the book of Job, which suggests to us that Job lived at about the same time and under roughly the same circumstances as Abraham. But we'll get to that when we get to that. In chapter 10, now there was a famine in the land. A famine in the land. Now, if you look at a place like, let's see if I can show you. There's another place. That looks dry, doesn't it? How much more dry would it need to be in order for there to be a famine? Well, not much. If you have the normal cycles of rainfall in the Middle East, you're going to discover the potential for famine. Lack of food, not enough to eat. So there was a famine in the land. And instead of staying in the land where God had promised Abraham a blessing, Abraham took Sarai and they went to Egypt. And here, Abram tells a story. He says, you're a beautiful woman, which I think is really nice of him to say. I think that shows this is a good husband. I like this guy. He says to his wife, "You're a beautiful woman." And when we get to Egypt, the men of the place are obviously going to try to steal you from me. So say that you're my sister. Now, honestly, I'm not sure how that is going to fix anything. But Sarai said, "Okay, well, I'll play your game." She pretended to be his sister, and the Egyptians were thinking seriously about inviting Sarai, perhaps not voluntarily, to become a part of the harem. When somebody noticed Abraham and Sarah cuddling off behind a pyramid someplace, and that was an embarrassing moment. And this is, it became obvious to the Egyptians that this is the man's wife, and we can't have this. So it's fascinating that that Abraham, in his lack of faith, commits the sin of lying to the Egyptians about something that's actually fairly important, and is rebuked by the Egyptians. He's rebuked by the idolaters. So this is a very bad thing. Now, what's fascinating about this particular story is that this is not the only time that it happens. It pops up here, and then later Abraham will use the same lie with a group that are called the Philistines. That even later we're going to get almost the same story with Isaac. So it's interesting. It's obviously fairly important. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time developing that, but it's kind of interesting. the reminder here, I think this is the part that I care about the most. Abraham is not perfect. Abraham is not the model of faith because he was always faithful. He was not. He and Sarai failed regularly, just like the rest of us. God didn't save Abraham because Abraham was good. Why did God save Abraham? Because God is good. Our salvation depends on the grace of God, not on our own good works. God never turns his back on Abraham, even though Abraham sinned. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that. That's not just a story. We see that same story all through the scriptures. But in Genesis, the patriarchs in particular are fully human. I can show you the sinfulness of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. These are not plaster saints. These are not the kind of saints you want to plop onto your dashboard to keep you safe from harm. These guys have got clay feet. They're fully human, and I'll emphasize, they're just like us. They're just like us. As we go on, I'm going to get away from this scribbled on slide and go on to the next slide. This is chapter 13. And this takes us up to the separation of Abram and Lot. Actually, the separation of their flocks and herds and whatnot. Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, all he had with Lot. And they went into the Negev, and from there they went north and from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where he'd set up his tent at the beginning between Bethel and Ai. So there's that spot again. This is in the hill country just north of Jerusalem. This photograph was taken from a place near Baitin, which I think is probably not Bethel, but it's close enough for all practical purposes. The city that you see off in the distance is Jerusalem. So there's Jerusalem. I'm about 10 miles north of Jerusalem, up in the hill country. And this is the spot. From this spot, or several others just like it, Lot and Abraham could see essentially forever. On a clear day, you could see a long, long ways. I've never been on that spot on a clear day. It's always like this, kind of hazy. But you still get a nice view of the territory. Now, Abram was rich in livestock. This is 13:2. And he journeyed to the place where he'd been near Bethel, and to the place where he had made an altar. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord again. And he called on the name of the Lord by means of sacrifice. Sacrifice is the means of worship. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds, and the land could not support both of them dwelling together. Their possessions were so great they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And Abram and Lot heard about this and decided to do the sensible thing, just separate. And Abram was the older and probably wiser of the two, and so he said to Lot, "We're going to have to separate our herds. This doesn't mean I don't like you anymore, but we're going to have to separate. So you choose the area of land that you want to pasture in, and I will take whatever is left, and we'll both be happy." And that led Lot to choose what we call the Valley of the Jordan. So Lot lifted up his eyes. This is verse 10 of chapter 13. And he saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. Now, I realize that none of us have been to Zoar. So we have to take it for granted that Zoar is a very pretty place with lots of nice trees and lots of growing things. Uh, the Egyptian Nile Valley is in fact a very fertile area. It's very green. Uh, Lots of food, fruit trees, pasture for goats and sheep, and it really is very nice. It's very productive. And the people of Egypt should be very prosperous. When they're not, all through history, it's been the result usually of corruption at the top, uh, which I'm afraid is true in most every nation. The corruption does more damage than the weather. But here we see Lot looking down on the Valley of Jordan. And as far as the eye could see, big cities, bright lights, happy people, lots of stuff growing. Now, today we know this area as the Dead Sea. And I'll get to maps of this a little later on, but the Dead Sea occupies this territory today. In chapter 13 of Genesis, the valley that is currently occupied by the Dead Sea had a river running through it that went all the way to the Gulf of Eilat. It was well watered, fertile, and heavily populated. Now, how do we know this? Well, we know this because that's what the Bible says. I read this part of the Bible, and obviously you've got Sodom and Gomorrah and Zeboim and Zoar and whatever the other little city is, but you've got the 5 cities of the plain. In between those are all the little agricultural settlements. This was a major, prosperous agricultural area. And today, it's a wasteland. It's the Dead Sea is 400 meters below sea level. It has no outlet, and so it's full of salt. The water does not support life, and the surrounding desert supports very little, very sparse life. It is not a nice place today. So what happened? What could possibly have happened? First of all, is there any evidence outside the Bible that there were cities in the Dead Sea Valley? And the answer is yes. I'm going to, let me see if I can do this again. I'm going to try to use my pointer as a pen. Okay, here we go. There, oh, gee whiz. I hate it when it happens. Okay. You know, this may be more trouble than it's worth. Just erasing everything. Okay, and then you have to hit the erase button. This is just not easy. And I gotta try it again. Okay, the name of the place that I'm thinking of is Ebla. Ebla is a site in Syria that was found about 40 years ago by a pair of Italian archaeologists. And this site is not too far from the Euphrates River, and it's one that had long been known. It's called Tel Marduk, and people had known that there was a big tell there for a long, long time. You know, it was part of local folklore. They made mythology about it. But Mattiai and Pettinato, a pair of Italian archaeologists, dug there in the 70s and 80s. And what they found was an entire new empire that nobody had ever heard of before, that existed prior to and during the lifetime of Abraham. So it seems to have been destroyed around 2000 BC. So this is a patriarchal thing. Among other things, we find an entirely new language that we call Eblaic. It also has the other languages of the region. It has diplomatic communications with Egypt in hieroglyphics and with Mesopotamia in cuneiform. But the new Eblaic language, also written in cuneiform, was discovered here. In the clay tablets of Ebla, among lots and lots of other detail, is the 5 cities. They are mentioned as trading partners with Ebla. And they're given names. Sodom and Gomorrah, and Zeboim and Zoar are the same 5 cities. And these are mentioned along with a bunch of names that we later on find in the Bible. So is this proof positive that God gave us the Old Testament? Well, no, this is just confirmation. It's one more piece of detail that helps us understand that, in fact, let's see if I can make a eraser. All right, here we go. Erase it all. Ooh, boy. Okay. Wonder if I can do that on my previous one. Oh, I'll bet you I can. Look at that. Oh, now it won't. Now it won't erase. Oh, man. Wonder if I can do it again. Oh, it doesn't give me the eraser. Oh, I hate that. All right, so be it. So at the time of Abraham, Sodom and Gomorrah were big cities, well populated, lots of people, lots of green stuff, happy place to live and raise a family. Lot went off and he settled in Sodom. He chose the valley of the Jordan, and he settled there in the land of Sodom. Abram, on the other hand, settled in the land of Canaan. He settled among the cities of the, and Lot settled among the cities of the valley. He moved his tent very close to Sodom. Then 1313 is foreshadowing of what's coming. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Let's say this is the beginning of a story that's going to unwind here for several chapters. The story of Sodom and its people, and Lot in the midst of them. Over in the New Testament, the New Testament authors speak of Lot as righteous Lot, whose righteous soul was dismayed at all of the sin that surrounded him. I believe that Lot is a believer. I think he's an immature believer. I don't think he was being faithful. I'm quite sure that he was not walking with God when he chose to live in Sodom. And having discovered what kind of a place Sodom was, Lot should have taken his family out of there as quickly as he could. Nevertheless, he stayed apparently for economic reasons. Lot could make a lot more money, no pun intended, in Sodom than he could out pasturing his flocks in the open country. There's nothing wrong with making a lot of money, but sometimes it's necessary to be careful what you're doing to your family. And here, Lot has made a huge mistake, and we see it foreshadowed here in verse 13. Now the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now we're getting something kind of important. lift up your eyes, look from the place where you are to the north, south, east, and west. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. This, as I counted, is the third time that we see this land promise. And this is specifically from Bethel, about 12 miles north of Jerusalem. This is the view from that spot. This, the place where this picture was taken is in what the Palestinians call the West Bank. That was a name given to Judea and Samaria by the Jordanians back in 1949. They overran the part of Israel that we call Judea and Samaria and annexed that land. They didn't give that up until the late 70s when they discovered that it was impossible to administer the land. And today, these are Palestinian administered territories. And Israel tries to stay out except where it's militarily necessary. There are roads going through here, but very little infrastructure. There are very few hotels, very few restaurants. It's actually quite difficult to visit sites in the West Bank. The biblical places that we're going to talk about a great deal in the rest of Genesis are in the West Bank. So this is all that territory. That's important because it's rather explicit. This is the place. The dirt that you're looking at here is the place that God gave Abraham. It's not some random place in the middle of Siberia or the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This soil that you see, the trees and rocks that you see from here, are precisely the place that God said, I'm going to give you and to your offspring forever. This particular land, you and your offspring forever. Arise, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. There's another altar. Now, Hebron is about 25 miles or about 40 kilometers south of Jerusalem. So from the spot that you see in this picture, if I were to walk directly south for about 70 kilometers, I would come to Hebron. All of this territory is the land that God promised to Abraham. That ends up being important. It continues to have political ramifications today. The Muslim powers who live in this area are demanding that the land be given to them. But God gave this to Abraham. God gave other land to the Arabic-speaking peoples. Perhaps they should go to the land that God gave them. This doesn't seem fair, but at any rate, chapter 14 takes us up to the next really interesting passage. This is the only statue of Melchizedek that I've got. I took this picture in Italy, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I've forgotten when we took this picture. Donna and I went to Assisi up in the central hill country of Italy. I went to Francis of Assisi's church, and out in the hallway, in a very dark area that was difficult to shoot, is this statue of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a very interesting character. His name, his position, his appearance on the scene and his disappearance all make him a very mysterious character. He doesn't need to be mysterious, but people often portray him as being quite mysterious. So in the days, this is 14:1, in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. These kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemember, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they'd served Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and all the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim and Sheva Kirianatham, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites and the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. Okay, I'm sorry. That's a whole bunch of geographic detail. This is a description of the line of march of 4 kings against 5 kings. We sometimes call this the battle of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. The king of Sodom was coming up against a regional coalition from not terribly far away, probably in the region we today call Syria, near the Euphrates River. There were these 4 tribal warlords from Mesopotamia. The most famous name is Kedorlaomer, and we actually find that name along with some of these other names in the dynastic lists of Mesopotamia. It's the cuneiform lists. So these are historical names of historical people. The tribal names are accurate. Those are places that we know about. The line of march is realistic. That's the line that would have been taken coming down the King's Highway. The position of the 5 kings of the plain as setting up a final defense of their valley is perfectly realistic. Here's the point I'm making. This is not mythology. This is not a fairy story. This is not a made-for-flannel graph account. This is history. And you can tell that it is history because of the details that are provided. These are details that wouldn't matter if I were J.R.R. Tolkien and I was telling you a story about orcs and elves. This is not a fairy tale. It is rather history. And all of these names, all of these places, all of these, all of the people that are involved, we can track. These are historical. So the king of Sodom, the king of Admah, and the rest of them joined together in the valley of Siddim with Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and the rest of them. And the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, bitumen in the English Standard Version. But this is tar. From this, we make today oil. Nobody in the ancient world recognized that tar was this enormously valuable chemical. Today, we would find tar pits and think, oh, we're rich. You know, let's buy the land real quick and pump this up and sell it to Texas. But in the ancient world, it was a hazard, something to avoid falling into. And so as they fought and as they fled, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fell into the tar pits. The rest fled to the hill country. The enemy took possession of Sodom and Gomorrah, all their provisions, and they went their way. And they also took Lot, son of Abram's brother. who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and they went their way. So here's the first thing that we learn. Lot apparently made a bad decision. And our decisions in life often have consequences. Sometimes those consequences are good ones, and sometimes they're bad ones. And the consequences play out in the normal course of events in history. When we make the bad decision to take our family and go and live in an evil city like Sodom, the predictable result is that any bad thing that happens to Sodom is going to have negative consequences for the family. And that's exactly what happened. It was predictable, and it's exactly what happened. I believe that Lot knew this and decided to take the risk. Today, we often have to balance risks and benefits. And I'm not saying there's an easy application from this principle, but Lot made a decision, and it turns out that decision was very bad. The longer he stayed in Sodom, the more it should have been obvious to him that he'd been misled, that he'd made a mistake, and that he needed to get out of there. Sometimes it's a good idea to run. Lot should have run. So Lot was captured along with all his possessions. Then those who had escaped came to Abram the Hebrew. By the way, that's the first time that the word Hebrew is used. The word Hebrew seems to come from a general background word that means one who has crossed over from the desert into the settled land. And so a nomadic people who have decided to settle down near the big cities was considered a Hebrew. The older Semitic word is Habiru. And we see these in a variety of places all through the secular Old Testament world of this time. The Mesopotamians and the Canaanites and the Egyptians all had their problems with nomads who tried to settle down on the margins of society. Abraham was one of these. He was an immigrant from elsewhere who had come and settled down. So he's known as Abram the Hebrew. And that was not meant as a nice thing. And he was living then by the oaks of Mamre. Let's see, the Amorite, Mamre the Amorite, who is a brother of Eshcol and of Aner. So Mamre and Eshcol and Aner are three brothers, and these were friends of Abraham, which is fascinating. Later on, the Amorites are going to end up being enemies, but at this point, they're friends. And the reason for that is that Abraham was an Amorite too. So Mamre and the others, Mamre and Eshcol and Aner, are Amorites. They too had come from Mesopotamia, probably a generation earlier than Abraham. And they'd come and they'd settled in the region, and it was his oak tree. That was his little patch of land. And they were all getting along fine, and they were friends. So that's where they're found. And Abram heard about his kinsman, that he'd been taken captive, and he led his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, Dan is as far north as you can go in modern Israel. From Dan, you can see the Syrian border to the north, Mount Hermon and the Syrian border. You can see Lebanon from Tel Dan. It's the northernmost point of Israel. In Abraham's time, it was probably the northern marker of the land that he considered his own. And so off he went, and he went as far as Dan. He divided his forces by night, defeated them, and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus, which is way out into the desert. Desert is actually a very beautiful place in biblical terms. Abraham went through Damascus and continued on the King's Highway as far as Hobah, which is the edge of the desert in Syria. Then he brought back all the possessions. He also brought back his kinsman Lot, along with his possessions and the women and the people. So all of the hostages were saved. And south they come from Damascus. They follow the King's Highway and eventually come through the Patriarchal Highway and begin heading south. They're heading home. And on the return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the king of Sodom went out to meet Abram at the valley of Sheva, that is the King's Valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, the people who were hostage, but take the goods for yourself." And Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord, the God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share." So they can take their share. I'm going to leave it completely alone. And you take your stuff with you. So we're going to go back here to, let's see if I can, oops, I can't share this. I'm going to unshare this. I have to remember the sequence. We're going to go back over here, share a screen. I'm going to go back to the whiteboard. And I want to think a little bit about Melchizedek, because he's a fascinating character. So Melchizedek. What do we know about him? Well, first of all, we need to take a look at his name. The word Melchizedek is actually two words, Melchi and Zedek. Melchi is king. It's the Hebrew word melech. So Melchi, king of Zedek. Zedek is tzedakah, righteousness. So he is the king of righteousness. He is also called the king of Salem. So Melchi Shalom. Salem, the Hebrew word shalom, means peace. So he is the king of righteousness. He is the king of peace. It's fascinating. And he brought out bread and wine for a blessing. So notice it is Melchizedek giving the blessing to Abram. Over in the book of Hebrews, we're going to discover that the greater always blesses the lesser. So a father blesses his sons, a king blesses his underlings, his leaders. The underling provides a tenth. So Abraham giving back to Melchizedek provides the tithe. He gave a tithe of all back to Melchizedek. So Abraham recognizes that Melchizedek is the great one. Here is Melchizedek. He is the one. He is the important one, and Abram is the lesser of the two. It's a fascinating meeting. I'm going to erase some of. Let's see how much of this I can erase. Okay, because I want to show you some other stuff. So we're going to see if I can erase some things. Oh, this is kind of fun. Ooh, boy, that all disappeared at once. Blessing of Abraham. Oops. Okay, so there's Melchizedek, and he is the king of Sodom. He is the king of Salem, king of peace, and he is the priest. Let's see if I can make the pen work again. He is a priest of God Most High. Again, this is a Hebrew word. El is the Semitic word for God. Elyon, Most High. So God Most High. The name God Most High is only used anywhere in the Bible on the lips of the Gentiles. Melchizedek existed before the time of Moses. So he does not know the name Yahweh. Abraham also lived in a time before Moses. Abraham, remember, started out a Gentile. And Abraham would have known the name El Elyon. He would have known about God Most High. The God who appeared to Abraham probably identified himself as God Most High. Very likely this is the same God that Noah spoke to. There is only one God in heaven above. The one true God is appropriately called God Most High. And Melchizedek is not only a king, he is also a priest. And as he comes to Abraham, his work here as a priest of God Most High and as the king is as a representative of general revelation. In the book of Romans, we talked about general revelation. In the creation and in the principles that govern the creation, God has revealed himself and has revealed enough that all men are without excuse. Well, Melchizedek is a man who was called to the position of leadership within a priesthood that existed prior to Moses, the Melchizedekian priesthood. Melchizedek is probably one representative of a larger movement of men of God who were the servants of God Most High. But Melchizedek is the representative that we meet here. And he represents general revelation. Abraham, on the other hand, is the representative of special revelation. Special revelation is Scripture itself. And Abraham is the father of the Jewish people, who 500 years later will begin receiving Scripture. This meeting of the two, a meeting of the two great representatives of God's revealing of himself is portentous. This ends up being an important meeting on a bunch of levels, but for now, we're just going to note that Abraham stops. He receives the blessing of Melchizedek. It is confirmed to him again that he has the blessing of God Most High, that he will be victorious in what he does. The king of Sodom grabs his stuff and his people and goes back to his city. Now, unfortunately, Lot went back to Sodom. We're going to run into Lot in Sodom yet again, and that'll happen on Friday. So that's as far as we'll get today. We actually got 3 chapters, which I think is a new record for us in Genesis. So we'll quit there today. Chapter 15 is a chapter that takes too long to get through. I'm not going to attempt it today. We'll do that on Friday. We'll probably get 15, 16, 17 on Friday. So I'm going to. This is fun, and it's always a pleasure speaking with you all. I'm looking forward to a time when I can see you all again. See if I can make this thing go. Yeah, can't hear you. Oh, there they are. There's some. Okay, everybody is unmuted. Okay, I don't even get it. Okay, there you are. There's Leanne. Okay, I see you guys. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yeah. Good night
you so
now.
much,
Sleep
Dr.
well. We'll see you Friday. Bye bye, preacher. See ya. Bye bye, guys. God bless now. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Buonanotte.
A domani.
A domani.
Domani.